For the last 2 weeks, I have done a video ranking every single unbeaten team in college football, and after having 22 teams last week, we are now down to 16. We're once again going to continue the series, as we're going to rank all 16 unbeaten teams, go through who they've beat, my thoughts on them, and then you're going to find out where they place. But before we can get started, nearly 80% of you guys are not subscribed to the channel, so quickly be sure to hit that subscribe button, leave a like if you want to support today's video, let me know what topic I should do next, and turn on notifications so you never miss when I upload. Now let's rank the 16 unbeaten teams. So in 16th place, we're first going to talk about Coastal Carolina. Coastal Carolina has sort of come out of nowhere under Jamie Chadwell, and right now the Chanticleers are 5-0. Led by star quarterback Grayson McCall, he has led them to wins over Army, Gardner-Webb, Buffalo, Georgia State, and then this past weekend, Georgia Southern. They barely survived against the Eagles, and so far the team has not been that impressive, but they are undefeated. In games against Marshall, Appalachian State, Virginia, and James Madison are at the back half of the schedule, so honestly, their undefeated ways could continue for a couple more weeks. At number 15, we have another Sun Belt team in James Madison. As they've made the transition from FCS to FBS, James Madison has been a pleasant surprise. So far, the Dukes are 4-0, have a star quarterback in Todd Centio, and they could be undefeated for a couple more weeks. In week 1, they beat Middle Tennessee 44-7. In week 2, they killed Norfolk State. And then in their third game, they had a miracle comeback over Appalachian State. This past weekend, they blew out Texas State, and they are now 4-0. So far, the Dukes haven't played anyone, but with games against Marshall and Louisville coming up, we're going to find out a lot about the Dukes. Number 14 through number 1 has become increasingly difficult, and even though I am higher on the Orange, I have Syracuse at number 14. In week 1, they beat Louisville pretty badly, but right now, Louisville's in a bad spot. In week 2, they beat UConn, and in week 3, they got their most impressive win of the season against Purdue. In week 4, they barely beat Virginia, and this past weekend, they beat Wagner 59-0. So far, Syracuse has wins over 3 Power 5 schools, and they are 5-0, but to be fair, they still haven't really beat anyone. Led by Garrett Schrader and Sean Tucker, the Orange are in a great spot, and they're definitely going to be a bowl team, but with games coming up against NC State, Clemson, and Notre Dame, we're to find out if Syracuse is legit or if they are a pretender. If you've been following the series, UCLA is one of those teams that I've been consistently saying I was going to wait and see on. Led by 5th-year quarterback Dorian Thompson-Robinson, the Bruins were expected to have a good season, but we wouldn't really know if they were legit until about midway through the year, as they had a horribly easy schedule to start out. They had easy wins over Alabama State and Bowling Green before they struggled to put away South Alabama. In week 4, they went on the road and beat Colorado, but that really wasn't saying much either. This past Friday, they got their first real test as an undefeated Washington team came to town. The number 15 Huskies were one of the Cinderella teams of the season and had arguably the top passing quarterback in the country in Michael Penix. UCLA found a way to put a stop to the hype, and despite giving the Huskies an opportunity to come back and win, they won 40-32, getting their first real win of the season. The Bruins are now 5-0, and they'll have back-to-back games against Oregon and Utah. We're going to find out a lot about UCLA's Pac-12 title hopes, but for now, UCLA is looking more legit by the week. At number 12, I have Penn State. Some probably think that they should be higher up on this list, but as of late, they've struggled a little bit. In week 1, they went on the road and had an impressive victory over Purdue before they came back home and beat Ohio. In week 3, they had a dominating and humiliating performance against Auburn as they won that game 41-12. Penn State was 3-0 and looking really good, but they did not quite put away Central Michigan as much as people expected. And then this past weekend, they only beat Northwestern by 10, but the Wildcats had a real chance of winning and competing in that game late in the second half. Right now, Penn State has a great running back duo, they have good receivers and a good defense, but the quarterback spot is something they're going to have to figure out if they want to keep their unbeaten record and actually have a chance at winning the Big Ten. Just like UCLA, TCU is a team that I was going to wait and see on. After Chandler Morris went down in week 1, Max Duggan took over at quarterback, and ever since then, the Horned Frogs have been on a roll. They killed Colorado on the road, beat Tarleton State at home, and then survived a furious comeback by SMU in week 4. That led the Horned Frogs to starting out with a 3-0 record. They'd have their Big 12 home opener against number 18 Oklahoma. Oklahoma just lost to Kansas State, but many expected a bounce-back performance. That is not at all how it went. Max Duggan in the TCU offense, and they beat Oklahoma 55-24. While it looks like the Sooners are extremely overrated, this is still a very impressive win, and Max Duggan looks like the real deal. He was the National Player of the Week, and TCU is now 4-0 and ranked number 17 in the country. This upcoming weekend, they have to go on the road to number 15 Kansas, and this was an unexpected battle that no one saw coming. This will be a battle of undefeated teams, and let's see what happens. Until this past weekend, we did not know what we had in Ole Miss. They moved on to a new quarterback and had a 4-man running back group. We had no idea if they were actually legitimate or not, as they only had wins over Troy, Central Arkansas, Georgia Tech, and Tulsa, and they struggled to put away Tulsa in week 4. The Rebels were ranked number 14 going into their matchup with Kentucky, and Kentucky was obviously undefeated and a top 10 team. For the most part, Ole Miss controlled that game, and ultimately they forced a late fumble and kept their undefeated streak alive, as they are now 5-0 and ranked number 9 in the country. I still don't know if Ole Miss is an actual SEC contender, but they looked good this past weekend, and currently I have them as the 10th best undefeated team. All of a sudden, USC is not looking as good as I once thought they were. I had them in the top 6 last week, but now I'm moving them down to number 9. After wins over Rice, Stanford, and Fresno State in their first 3 weeks, they got their first test against Oregon State. The Trojans needed a late touchdown to win that game, and while many thought the Beavers were maybe a top 4 team in the Pac-12, they've all of a sudden fallen apart, and that win does not look as good anymore. This past weekend, USC struggled to put Arizona State away, and if it weren't for Colorado, the Sun Devils would be the worst team in the conference. It looks like USC still hasn't really beaten anybody. There are questions about the defense, and I wonder if they are actual contender. In the next 2 weeks, they play against Washington State and Utah, which are probably the 2 best teams that will have played to this point, and if they can remain unbeaten through that, then maybe they will be legit. For now, they have moved down a little bit to number 9. I am extremely high on the Tennessee Volunteers, but with them not playing last week and 2 other teams having great performances, I have moved them down to number 8, but they'll easily have a chance to climb back up. The Volunteers had a lot of hype with their senior quarterback Hendon Hooker in year 2 under Josh Heupel. They put up a ton of points in week 1 against Ball State, and then survived an overtime thriller on the road against Pitt in week 2. That game was awesome, and then they went and killed Akron in week 3. They get a major test in week 4 against number 20 Florida, and after playing well the entire game, they let up some late points to the Gators, and they had a chance to win by way of a late Hail Mary. Thankfully, they ended up stopping them, and Tennessee cruised to 4-0 and ranked number 8 in the country. This past weekend, they were on bye, and they now have to travel to number 25 LSU. This will be a huge matchup, and if Tennessee can win this, they will be undefeated for their game against Alabama. I still think the Volunteers are a legitimate SEC contender, but we're going to find out a lot in these next 2 weeks. It is really hard to ignore Kansas right now. In year 2 under Lance Leipold, the Jayhawks have had an explosive offense, a star quarterback in Jalen Daniels, and they have now beaten 4 Power 5 schools. In week 1, they beat Tennessee Tech. In week 2, they went on the road and beat West Virginia. In week 3, they beat a future Power 5 team in Houston. And then in week 4, in a battle of unbeatens, they beat Duke. Somehow that wasn't good enough to get them into the top 25, but this past weekend, they beat Iowa State at home, and they are now 5-0 and ranked number 19 in the country. Kansas has looked good in all 5 of their wins. They have beaten 4 solid schools, have a very good quarterback, and right now it's impossible to deny that the Jayhawks are in a good spot. I currently have them at number 7, but will they be able to hold up this weekend? College game day is coming to Lawrence, and they now have to play a hot, undefeated number 17 TCU team. We're going to find out a lot in the next couple of weeks, and we'll see if Kansas can keep it going. Who was the other team that passed Tennessee? Well, it was Oklahoma State. Led by 4th-year quarterback Spencer Sanders, the Cowboys have been a winning program over the last 2 seasons, and that's why they started out in the top 25. Many expected the Cowboys to be a Big 12 contender, and they get off to a good start. They beat Central Michigan in week 1, beat Arizona State at home in week 2, and then kill Arkansas Pine Bluff in week 3. We didn't really know what we had in the Cowboys, as none of those 3 teams were any good, but this past weekend, they had to go on the road to Baylor. Not only did Oklahoma State win that game, but they pretty much controlled it from start to finish. They won 36-25, and Oklahoma State looks like a legitimate contender right now. They have a great offense, a good defense, and they now have a good win to their name. Welcome to the top 6, Oklahoma State. Week by week, the Michigan Wolverines are looking a little bit more legit. Last year, they made it to their first college football playoff appearance under Jim Harbaugh, but we were not going to find out anything about this year's team until week 4. They had a terrible non-conference schedule of Colorado State, Hawaii, and UConn, and as expected, they blew out every single team. In week 4, they get their first test as Maryland would come to town, and while I think the Terps are definitely a bowl team, I don't think the game should have been as close as it was. Nevertheless, they survived in their first test. Then this past weekend, they would play against their first elite defense in Iowa. This game was never close, and Michigan ended up winning 27-14. That was the most points Iowa has allowed this season, and Michigan now has 2 good wins to their name, and they are the number 5 team in my opinion. Moving down from number 2 to number 4, we have the Georgia Bulldogs. If you read social media Saturday night, you would have thought that Georgia had lost. This past weekend, the Bulldogs went on the road to play against Missouri, and if you're unfamiliar with how this season has gone, Mizzou is not any good. The Tigers led the entire game until the 4th quarter. Stetson Bennett struggled, and they did just enough to win the game, winning 26-22. Combining that with an uninspired performance against Penn State, the Bulldogs are still undefeated and probably the favorite to win the SEC East, but they are slowly starting to trend down, and maybe the gap between them and Tennessee and Kentucky is not as big as we originally thought. Georgia is obviously still a powerhouse, but they now move down. With each passing weekend, Clemson football is getting better and better. Many wondered if DJ Uiagalelei would get benched for Cade Klubnik, but right now, DJ is putting on a show and is winning games. In week 1, they beat Georgia Tech, and then had 2 home victories over Furman and Louisiana Tech. Week 4 beat Clemson's first major test, as they'd have to go on the road and play number 21 Wake Forest. DJ would have 5 touchdowns in that game, and would outduel Sam Hartman to a 51-45 overtime victory. There is still a lot to be desired from that defense, but could they come home and beat a top 10 NC State team? That was the big question mark, and they definitely put the NC State hype to rest. They beat the Wolfpack 30-20, and that game was never really closed. While the Pack did hang around, Clemson controlled the entire game, DJ looked good, and the Clemson team overall just looked very balanced. They now have 2 top 25 victories to their name, 2 important ACC matchups out of the way, and they are 5-0. You could argue they are the best team in college football, but for now I have them at number 3. At number 2, we have the Ohio State Buckeyes. Going into the season, they were the projected winner of the Big Ten, and many believed that CJ Stroud was the best quarterback in college football. In week 1, they would take care of number 5 Notre Dame, and while that win does not look as impressive now, that was still a good win. In week 2, they killed Arkansas State. In week 3, they killed Toledo, and in week 4, they killed Wisconsin. The offense has been explosive, the defense has looked good, and those were 2 good wins to their name. This past weekend, they blew out Rutgers 49-10, and while no one expected that game to be close, Ohio State continues to play dominating football. They now have 3 Power 5 wins, and things are looking really good for them. Their next 3 weeks are games against Michigan State, Iowa, and Penn State, and I expect all 3 of those to be victories, and this team is playing extremely well without their star receiver, Jackson Smith-Njigba. Ohio State looks good, and they're now number 2 in the country for me. At number 1, I have the Alabama Crimson Tide. Going into the season, the Tide were obviously going to be the favorite, and it was for good reason. They returned arguably the top 2 players in college football in Bryce Young and Will Anderson, and it's Nick Saban at the helm. What else did anyone expect? In week 1, they blank Utah State 55-0, before they would survive a scare on the road against Texas in week 2. In retrospect, they really should have lost that game, but they squeaked it out, and that was all that mattered. They'd beat UL Monroe in week 3, before they'd come home and kill Vanderbilt 55-3. The Tide were 4-0, and many were saying they needed to see a real good victory from them. That is exactly what they did this past weekend, as they went on the road and beat number 20 Arkansas 49-26. They dominated the line of scrimmage and just looked like the better team. While they fell apart in the third quarter, Bama had a complete performance and Jahmyr Gibbs broke out. What makes this victory even better is that Bryce Young went down, and when Jalen Milroe came in, nothing changed. They won this game in a dominating fashion with their backup quarterback, and for me right now, Alabama is still the number 1 team in the country until there is a reason to move them down. But what do you think? What did they get right and wrong on this list? Who is going to be the last unbeaten from this list? And what are your thoughts on all of these teams moving forward? Be sure to let me know down below. Leave a like if you want to support today's video, subscribe if you're new, and check out all my other videos on the end screen. I hope to see you guys again soon, but until next time, peace.